Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and today we're going to continue looking at basic sections that make up most websites. And what is today's section? We're talking about social proof. I follow some people who talk about landing pages and how to make them persuasive, and one of the big things that they emphasize is social proof because it's one of the main ways you can initially start to build trust with a visitor. So let's start by taking a look at some examples of social proof from some well-established product websites. So let's go ahead over to ClickUp, and can you spot the social proof here? Immediately in the hero, we have the review listing right below the call to action. So this is gonna show a number of stars, show how many reviews, 10,000 plus, which is immediately convincing that this is a well-established product. And it lists where those reviews are from. So that's one form of social proof, which would be, your Trustpilot or your Google reviews, that type of thing. But it doesn't have to come from a third party. You can build this type of element yourself to list an aggregate of reviews that you have across multiple different platforms. So we'll probably tackle this type of social proof element, but there are a couple others as well. So let's scroll on down. And the next bit of social proof is a list of logos for companies or clients that use your product or that you've worked with. This is a really powerful piece of social proof because you can list well-known entities that will immediately make a random visitor think you're legitimate, which hopefully you actually are, but they don't know that. So you have to show them who you've worked with to indicate that you're established in your industry or your niche or whatever you're providing. Let's scroll on down and look at one more form of social proof, which I bet you can guess what it's going to be. If we keep going, we have testimonials. Testimonials are interesting. Before, we had our list of well-known logos for companies that people would recognize, and that builds one form of trust. Now we have actual faces and names attached to endorsements, essentially. It's kind of like a celebrity endorsement, except for with testimonials, generally they're not paid for. And most testimonials, in my experience, are offered up by people who are just enthusiastic about your product or your service. So testimonials are really, really powerful. So those are the three types of social proof we're going to tackle today. But let's go ahead and look at another couple of examples before we jump into building these elements. So here's Airtable. If we scroll down, we're going to immediately find our logo list. And the interesting thing about this type of element is it's so ubiquitous, you don't even really need to label it. You can see over here on ClickUp, they did list what the logos indicate. Join 800,000 plus highly productive teams. So these are teams or companies with teams that use their product. But over here on Airtable, you don't even need to list what these logos indicate because people know generally when they see a list of logos on a product or service website, those are probably places that the product or service has worked with. I do think it would be nice to add a label, probably for accessibility reasons, because I doubt that this reads out very well with the screen reader, but I could be wrong. Let's go ahead and scroll down and see what else we can find. Now, we didn't find any reviews here, no stars listed anywhere, which is okay. You don't have to have all these forms of social proof, but I'm noticing most of these websites I'm looking at have at least two. And so we have the logo list, and now we have these testimonials, which this is a really nice testimonial layout. Now let's jump over to the last example, which is Monday.com. No social proof in the hero, which if you have the option to do it, probably a good idea. But if we scroll down, we should pretty quickly see, yep, there's our logo list. So you'll notice this comes pretty much right after the hero on all of these websites. Again, it depends on the type of site you're building. But for a lot of products and services, this is going to make a lot of sense. And if we scroll on down, let's see if we can find any other social proof here. And right there is a testimonial. These are pretty interesting because they're present, but they're not super bold. And they're kind of between other bits of content, which is kind of cool. Let's scroll on down and see if we can find anything else that relates to social proof. It doesn't look like we're going to run into anything else here. It looks like we might have some interesting use cases here, but that doesn't really fall under social proof. There is a testimonial. Let's see. So this is like a testimonial slider, which I'm not really a big fan of sliders, but this is one way you can display some testimonials. Probably wouldn't be my first choice, And then here we have some stars. So this is kind of what I was talking about, where it's not pulling a review widget or anything from a specific platform, but it's showing a number of stars, 5 stars, of course, and saying loved by customers based on 10,000 plus customer reviews. So that's a pretty interesting approach. So the first thing we're actually going to build here is this. We're going to build a little star rating thing that we can insert anywhere on our site. So let's jump over to this in progress website that we've been working on here. And I'm thinking we can add our star rating right in the hero. So this will be our first bit of social proof. So like with a lot of elements that we're going to build, we're going to start this with a div. Let's go ahead and drop a div in. Then we're going to need a couple of things. If we want to copy this layout exactly, we need 5 stars, then some text, and then some logos. So let's go ahead and just do that. So the way I would probably do this is I would add a couple of sub divs here. So I'll drop another div in. That's going to be our top row. Then let's duplicate that, and that will be our bottom row of logos. Now in this top one, we can just add an icon element. Now in previous videos in this series, we haven't really gotten into classes, but today we're going to talk about classes a little bit. Classes are a way to allow you to apply styles to multiple elements at once. They're really just a CSS concept. So if you know about CSS, you know about classes. But if you're someone who's just primarily used visual builders and has never written much CSS, this might be a somewhat new concept to you. Let me illustrate. Let's say I add a color to this icon. Let's make it red, and let's reduce the size. And just to follow along with our theme, let's make it a star. Okay, so I've got a star I like, but I need to have 5 of these. So let's duplicate it 5 times. 2, 3, 4, 5. Perfect. And then we can select our div and lay it out horizontally. This is great, but let's say I've now decided I want to change the color of these stars or the size. Let's go ahead and change the size, and the color is going to be kind of a yellow. Unfortunately, that change does not propagate across these other stars, which means I now have to either delete all of these and then duplicate the initial one, or I have to go to each star and make the exact same changes, which just makes no sense. We're not going to do that. That's not a good workflow, and you'll waste a lot of time that way. My general rule with classes is anytime you have a style that you're going to apply to a lot of different things and that you want to have consistent across all of those things, you should use a class. Now let's go ahead and clear all of the styles on this icon. So the blue ID badge indicates that we've been styling this on the ID, which is what you would do if you were not going to have multiple instances of this icon. But since we want consistent styling across multiple instances of this icon, we're going to go ahead and clear all the styles on the ID. And instead of applying them to the ID, we'll add a class called review-star. Now let's reperform the exercise I just did, showing how inconvenient it was to apply those styles across multiple elements. So let's first go to kind of a yellow golden color here. And then let's reduce the icon size down a bit. Maybe let's do 22 pixels. Now we're just going to duplicate this icon a few times, 4 or 5. Now you can see everything matches, but if we want to make a change later, because we've used a class and we have the class selected up here at the top of the properties pane, we can go ahead and adjust the styles, and it applies to every element. That uses this class. Again, this is just a CSS concept that you're using a visual interface to work with. So again, if you're going to repeat a bunch of elements and you want them all to have the same style, use a class. It'll save you a bunch of work later on. So now that we have our stars, let's go ahead and select the div that they're inside of, and let's add a text element. Now this is going to be pretty small if we match the styling they have over here, which is questionable. You might not want to go this small, but since the text isn't super important, I guess, we can get away with it. And for some reason, their text is inside a div, which isn't great. We're not going to do that. We're actually going to use a paragraph element. So let's change the tag to paragraph. And then paragraphs do have some default styles, which you have to wrestle with a little bit. For this instance, we're going to go to advanced custom CSS and set margin block start to 0 and margin block end to 0. And speaking of saving time, we've just applied this directly to this element. The problem with that is if we add another text element and change it to a paragraph, we're going to have to fight those same styles. Since we anticipate maybe using paragraphs across multiple different areas on our site, We can save a bunch of time by adding a style sheet. So let's add a new style sheet and we'll call it social proof. And now we can write just a little bit of simple CSS to fix this. So we just add the P element, open and close curly braces, margin, block, start, 0, margin, block, end, 0. This will now be applied everywhere across our site. So now we don't have to mess with those styles on every paragraph element we create. It'll just automatically be done by our style sheet. Now let's go ahead and change this text a little bit. Let's say based on 10K plus reviews. And then we're gonna need some logos down here. We also might reduce this size a little bit. I think they're using like 12 on the example, which I probably wouldn't go that small. I think I might even keep it maybe at 16 pixels because it's really not going to be readable if you're setting it to 12 pixels, or smaller than 16 really is a bad idea. So that being the case, let's select this div here. Let's vertically align everything to the middle, and then let's add a gap of 16 pixels. And actually, we can't use a gap because those stars are not in their own container, so it's going to add a gap between each and every element, which we don't really want. We want the stars pretty close together, but we want some space after the stars before this text. So in this case, we can go to the text element, go to advanced size and spacing, and set the margin on the left to 16 pixels. Now let's go ahead and add our logo. So I'm going to drop in an image, and then we're going to browse and see if we have, here's a logo we can use. And there's our logo. Now we need to add some space around these, give them some room to breathe. Let's go ahead and select the div that they're inside of and go to advanced size and spacing and add maybe 8 pixels on the top and bottom. And then we can adjust the size of this, but let's go ahead and duplicate it a couple of times. We'll just do 3 logos here. Then we'll select the containing div again and set it all to layout horizontally. Now we need to set this div to 100% width, and then we'll do space between for how to lay out those elements, maybe space around. There we go. That looks pretty nice. These are still maybe a little bit big, but it really just depends on the logos that you happen to be using. So whether this is the perfect place to put it in the hero, I don't know. We might move it around. I guess it might look a little bit better below the button here. Let's try that. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. It gets it out of the way a little bit, but still is very prominent in the hero. And we still get to see our little screenshot sneak peek down there. So let's save this and take a look on the front end at what we've done. Looks pretty good, and it immediately shows that we have a bunch of reviews. So that's the first bit of social proof that I wanted to cover. Really simple to build, but also really powerful in terms of hopefully turning website visitors into paying customers or clients, whatever the case may be. Now, the next thing I want to build, because it's also going to be a pretty quick little build, is our list of companies that we've worked with. And we're going to do it in this darker section down here. So this is really a very basic element. Let's go over and look at this one, for example. We just have some overline text and some logos. So this should just take a few seconds to build. Let's go ahead and add a div here. Now we're gonna have some overlap because of the way this section is structured. We're gonna have to add some top padding here. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go to advanced size and spacing and just increase the padding until our div becomes visible. We're gonna need way more than that, maybe 500. And then we'll back it down until it's about where we want it in relation to the element above it. So maybe about right there. Now, this div does need to be 100% width, so let's go ahead and do that. Now we need our text, so let's do some text. And for overline text, I usually like to make it maybe a little bit smaller, but also a little heavier. And we'll set it to advanced typography, text transform, capitalize. We're also going to set it to a crisp white color so that it pops against that darker background. Now we'll say, trusted by the brands you know. Perfect. Now another thing we're going to want to do is just center everything horizontally within this div. Now the next thing we can do is we can go ahead and add another div, because anytime you want to change the direction of elements within a container, generally you're going to need another container. So our main div is laying things out vertically, but now we want to lay out our logos horizontally. So we're going to add a div to do that. And this will be set to horizontal. And for this one, I think we'll do space around as well to get those logos laid out how we want. Now let's drop in some images, and we'll need to go ahead and drop in our logos. So let's go ahead and browse for those. And we have a few here, and they're all pretty small. They're also kind of dark, so we're going to need to make some adjustments there. But let's go ahead and get them all in. First, let's just hit Command or Control D to duplicate this a few times. We'll do maybe 5 logos. Then we'll swap out the image on each of these. We'll just work down through these logos that I've uploaded. These are all from Logo Ipsum, by the way, which is a great source for placeholder logos. So let's grab this one. And then our last logo. It's going to be that one there. Now note that they're not all the same color, which might be kind of tricky here. If you can get logos that are all grayscale or all colored or whatever, it's going to be much easier to get them to look good on a given background. So let's go ahead and set the div that contains them to align everything to the middle. And then let's set its width to 100%. Let's see how that looks. It looks pretty good. Now, we're going to want some space between the text and the logo row. So we'll just use gap here. We'll do 16 pixels, maybe 32. That looks pretty good. Now we've got to figure out how to make these dark logos stand out on the dark background. I'm not sure exactly what the best option is going to be, so we're going to start working through some different approaches and see what works. So first, I think we can select the div itself, go to Effects, and go to Filter, and kind of play with the inversion option. So let's try inverting everything by 100. And that pretty much did the trick. Now, the coloration's a little off on some of these. Again, it's best to have logos that are either all black or all white, or at least all the same-ish color. But we can further adjust this image itself. Since we applied the filter to the div that contains it, now we can select the image and go to Advanced Effects, Filters, and play with the filters here. Now, I think the problem is that it's just not quite pure white, so we can maybe up the brightness to 100%. And it looks like we need to just finagle this control a little bit. If we set it to 0, it makes it white. So we'll do that. Let's try that here as well. Advanced Effects, Filter, and we'll do brightness and set it to 0. And that looks much better. So we've taken these elements that were all kind of dark or black, and we've used Oxygen's filtering options to kind of invert them and brighten them up. Let's go ahead and do the same filter on this one, brightness and 0. And that's going to brighten it up as well. So we would probably want to perform that trick on all of them, but let's go ahead and look on the front end with this new element. And it looks really good right below this screenshot. So now our landing page is really shaping up to really build trust with the visitor. We have our reviews, and now we have just some recognizable logos from companies within our niche that help us build trust with our visitor. So the last thing we want to do is a testimonial. Now, normally you probably wouldn't stack all of these social proof elements so close together, but since this is just an example, I think I'm going to put a testimonial card right below these logos. The one I kind of want to build is this one from Airtable. So we have a left-hand side with an image of a person, a right-hand side with their company and logo, a quote, their name, and then a link to a video, which theoretically you would have. Now, something I like to do when I'm rebuilding something like this is I'll take a screenshot, and I'm going to go ahead and just download this to my computer. And now what we can do is we can actually just upload that screenshot into an image element here. This keeps us from having to go back and forth and cross-reference a bunch. So I'll just drop that in here and let it upload, and then select the image. So now we have this element we want to build. I actually even like the way it overlaps on the bottom there. Let's go ahead and collapse that. And we're just going to rebuild this with actual elements in our Oxygen design. So let's add some space below this div. Let's add something like, I don't know, 128 pixels to give it some room to breathe. And then let's see what's going on with this section here. Why is it not adapting? I bet we set the height. Yeah, we set the height to a static value. So anytime you want an element to be the full height of the browser, use min height, not height. because now it's not actually adapting to the height of the content within it. To do that, we just need to remove the height declaration here. So we'll just set that back to pixels. Now it'll adapt. But we also kind of want the overlap. So I think we'll remove the bottom padding, and then we'll do a negative bottom margin on our card once we've built it. So as per usual, we're going to start with a div element. We actually could use a columns element here. I don't always use the columns element because it does have some restrictions, but I think in this case, it will be the quickest way to get a nice side-by-side layout like we want. So let's just do that. Let's do it the easy way. So we'll do columns, and we'll drop that in. Let's move that above our image since that's just a reference here. And we'll choose 50-50. So immediately we've got a pretty nice little layout here. The columns element itself needs to have a white background. So make sure that's selected and set the background color to white. Now on the left-hand side, we need an image. Now I'm not sure if I have an image of a person in the proper aspect ratio here, but let's see what we have. Well, here's somebody. Let's drop them in. Now we want it to be a bit taller. So what we can do is we can actually set the aspect ratio to something like 9/16. And of course, that's going to look really bad because it all stretches. Let's reduce this to 12. So that's a bit closer to what we want. And then we can change the object fit to cover. And that's going to fix the skewing in the image. So anytime you're playing with the image's aspect ratio, you'll probably want to tweak your object fit. And you could do something like contain to, but then you're going to end up with some space. You can do fill, but then you're going to get the skewing and stretching again. So cover is really a handy option here. So we are already well on our way. One thing I notice is that our padding around the image is just a bit too big. So we're going to reduce the padding on these. So let's select this column. We'll go to advanced size and spacing. And by default, it's set to 16. We'll reduce it to 8 here on the ID. And then we'll do the same thing over on this div before we start adding things to it. So 8, 8, 8, 8. And we might actually end up wanting more over there because they've actually got quite a bit more spacing. So let's do 32 all the way around on that side. Now, this is a pretty simple layout. We don't need to change directions of anything. We just need to control the space between the elements. So let's go ahead and just drop in all the elements we need. We're going to add a text element. Now, if we want to include a logo, we will probably want to wrap this text element in a div, but for now, we'll just do text elements. So we're going to need that text element, the one that has their actual quote, one for their name, one for their title or position, and then we'll need a link for watch video. So that will be a text link, and we'll do watch video. All right, so now we can start populating this content. So we'll just pick a name for the company, Super Awesome Inc. And then we'll go ahead and add some text. We'll just use lorem ipsum for this, ipsum 1p, and then we'll add quotes around it over here. Perfect. And then we need the person's name and their position at the company. So we'll do Jane Smith, and then Director of Awesomeness, Super Awesome Inc. So there's all of our content. Now we need to style everything. So this up here needs to be pretty heavy. So we'll set the font weight to maybe 900. That looks pretty good. Then this text needs to be bigger. So we're going to adjust the size of it. Let's do 2 rem. That's probably way too big. Let's try 1.25. And probably we have way too much text. So let's shorten this a little bit. We don't want to run out of room, so it's very important to be careful about how much text you're using when you have the option. So that looks pretty good. We also want to increase the weight here, but we're not going to be as heavy as the company name there. And then we're going to increase the weight of the name. We'll go down to maybe 600. Maybe we'll go a little heavier on that. Let's do 800. And let's do 800 for the company name too, just to be consistent. I don't like having a bunch of different weights. And maybe this one can stay at the default weight. Since it's bigger, we don't also necessarily need to emphasize it with a weight as well. Now this one, I probably would go to advanced typography and set it to italic. And then this watch video text is just going to be the standard size. So now we can use gap to space everything out. Now we are going to want a different amount of space between these two elements. There's 2 ways we could do it. We could add the gap and then remove the gap with a negative margin, kind of messy. I think I would prefer to wrap this thing in a div and then just group them together that way. So we'll wrap that in a div and then drop this other text in there with that. And that will allow it to escape the wrath of the gap. So let's select this div here and let's set the gap to something big and see how it looks. That actually looks pretty good. Now it's quite a bit smaller because our overall text size is smaller. I wonder, maybe we could go to advanced typography and just set a different base text size here. Let's do the font size at 1.25 rem. And that beefs everything up. Then we'll also need to beef this up a little bit. So 1.5 rem. Now that we have less text, don't need as much space. That looks pretty good. Now they have everything top aligned. We could keep it that way. We could also move everything to the middle, which doesn't look too bad, or we could reduce the height of the image to get it all kind of looking a little bit better. Instead of doing that, let's actually add a company logo here. So let's add an image element and let's browse for our image. Let's pick one of these logos here. This one should look pretty good. And then let's move that up above the company name. That actually looks pretty good. So now you have an identifiable logo from the company they work for, a quote, who the quote is by, and then a link to a video if you have a video. Now, because this image's color doesn't really match our site a whole bunch, let's go ahead and go to Advanced Effects Filter, and let's adjust the hue rotate to give it maybe a more purple/bluish look. See what we got here. And if that doesn't work, we can always just go with the classic grayscale. So let's do that and let's just pump that up. That looks pretty good. It looks a little more elegant since this website is pretty clean and crisp. So there's our pretty cool testimonial element. The last thing I want to do is add a negative overlap on the bottom. So we'll go to Advanced, Size and Spacing, and set a negative margin of maybe 300 pixels. And I actually have the wrong element selected, so let's back that up. Let's make sure we have the columns element selected and reperform that. We'll go to Advanced Size and Spacing, negative 300 pixels margin. So now we have this nice overlap between this darker section and the next section. Let's save and take a look. So starting from the top, what we worked on today is we have our reviews listed here with some logos. Theoretically, these logos would be the places that you sourced the reviews from. So if you have those reviews, definitely show them off because it'll probably help people decide to buy your thing. Then we go ahead and scroll down. We have our nice company logos here exhibiting who has worked with us or who we've worked for. And then we have our testimonial. And that overlap just looks really nice. It's nice and prominent, which means nobody scrolling through your site is going to miss this bit of social proof. Now, the last bit of tweaking we need to do is let's make sure everything works on mobile. So I expect we'll have some problems with that testimonial, but it may not be too bad. So this looks pretty good. Everything looks fine here. Let's go down to this size. Of course, we have some issues with our overlap here, so we can go ahead and adjust our bottom padding on that section to get it all looking good again. This all still looks fine. Our testimonial, the image is maybe a little bit big, but that's kind of a matter of taste. It's pretty prominent there. And if you want it to remain prominent on mobile, you can certainly leave it like that. So we actually don't have any major issues with these on mobile because of the way we built them. But if you are building elements in Oxygen, it's always a good idea to go through and make adjustments at the breakpoints where you do find issues, because with some layouts, you're going to run into things getting a little cramped and you might want to adjust the layout a bit. For instance, this logo list is starting to get a little bit cramped, so we could just go ahead and allow multi-line, and then we could do space around, and then we could add a gap of like 32 pixels or something like that to give them some space. And that's going to give them some room to breathe. Now, you'd need to tweak this to make sure everything looks correct. But then as the screen gets smaller and smaller, they will wrap to the next line. So again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's another basics tutorial showing you how to create some tried and true social proof elements on your site using Oxygen. Thank you very much for watching.